Hello, and welcome to the Unworthy Leader Podcast. I'm Kendra Dahlstrom, an executive coach to Fortune 500 leaders, and this show is about flipping the script on leadership. Here we talk openly about the parts most people want to hide, like self-doubt, imposter syndrome, fear, and what I like to call the messy middle. We all experience this, and I believe true leadership isn't about perfection. It's about honesty, wholeness, and showing up. You'll hear real stories, researched, backed insights, and conversations about leading authentically, even when you may feel unworthy. Let's dive in. Hey, just jumping in here real quick because I recently learned that only 2% of our listeners actually subscribe to our show. Please be sure to hit follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you've got a second, leaving a quick review helps more imperfect leaders like and find us. Thanks for being part of our journey. Welcome to another episode of the Unworthy Leader Podcast. This is your host, Kendra Dahlstrom, and I am very excited for today's conversation. Today, I have Dr. Jill Stoddard. She is not only an international TEDx speaker, she's an award-winning former professor, a 3-time book author, a licensed psychologist, coach, and co-host of the Psychologist Off the Clock podcast, which is actually ranked in the top. Dr. Stoddard is an entrepreneur who also founded the Center for Stress and Anxiety Management in California. Her books have been translated into more than a dozen languages and include the big book of ACT Metaphors, Be Mighty, and Imposter No More. Her thoughts have also appeared on the Washington Post, New York Times, Women's World, Today.com, Psychology Today, Scary Mommy, Thrive Global, The Good Men Project, Mindful Return, and the Boston Globe. And there's more. She happens to live currently in Newburyport, Massachusetts, with her husband, 2 kids, and a disobedient bulldog. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Jill.
Thank you for having me, Kendra. And luckily, my disobedient French bulldog is not here, or you would hear him snoring very loudly in the background.
I put mine away too. It can be rough. It can be rough. So I'm really excited about talking with you today because I've been wanting to get more experts on this show who actually have scientific backed evidence and the experience, through their own studies and work, which you clearly have, to really help me unpack this whole idea around imposter, quote unquote, syndrome. And I'd love for you just to share a little bit about how you even realized that you wanted to write a book on this topic, and then we can kind of dive into imposter phenomenon a little.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I was always pretty aware that this phenomenon existed. And of course, I experienced it personally. And I would say the time that jumps out the most at me is when I was applying to graduate school. And I had a mentor who recommended, she knew what I wanted to do. And so she recommended I apply to this one program at Boston University. And I was living in San Diego at the time, and Boston was home. And I didn't really want to move home, but I trusted her. So I applied. But it was very competitive. I knew there was absolutely no way I was going to get in. So I didn't tell my family. And then the guilt sort of ate away at me that I was like keeping this big secret. So eventually I told my dad, I'm applying to work with this guy, David Barlow at BU. And my dad, who's a business guy who knows literally nothing about mental health, says, Dave Barlow, the psychologist? And I was like, what? Yeah. And it turned out they had played golf a handful of times together and they belonged to the same club. So fast forward, he tells Dave that I'm applying to the program, and fast forward a few months and I somehow miraculously got into this extremely competitive program. And I just felt sure that it had to have been because he knew my dad, that the program director knew my dad. And now that was 25 years ago. And you just read my bio. I've achieved a few things in that time. And I've told this story a number of times, and I hate telling the story because I'm quite certain that everyone listening is thinking, well, obviously that's what happened. What other possible explanation could there be? Now, the rational part of me knows that's actually very offensive to Dave Barlow to think that he would sacrifice his integrity and let in, a mediocre person who doesn't deserve to be there when there's only 12 slots for students, right? So like rationally, I get that, but it's just this deep feeling that like any minute people are going to figure out I never really deserved to be there. And so the concept interested me insofar as, they say research is me search, or the new one I heard that I love is your mess is your message, which I think is so
That's
great.
my life.
Right. But what made me get more into it and want to write the book is I thought for sure once I achieved enough things, I would outrun it. I would prove to myself, well, certainly if I write a book, well, certainly if I do a TED Talk, then I'll finally feel legitimate. And it still hasn't happened. And so when I started to dig in, I saw, oh, as a matter of fact, success is correlated with the imposter experience. And often the more success you have, the more you might tend to feel it. We don't know exactly why, but, we think it's essentially you have more to prove. The higher you go, the more you have to prove. And I often think of people when they win Oscars and they're interviewed and they're like, well, now you must feel like you're the top of the world, and they say, well, no, now I have this reputation I have to defend. Now I have to live up to that Oscar in every single thing that I do. And so that was the piece that really got me the most interested in the phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah. And just from my own personal experience working with corporate leaders and very high functioning Fortune 50 companies, what I've seen, Dr. Jill, is that you're right. The higher they go, the higher their expectations are. Therefore, their standards increase, and then the pressure
exactly
increases.
Right.
What I think is also fascinating is that the more that they rely on external validation, which I think could be an element of imposter phenomenon that I want to talk to you about, the more that they end up performing well. So it's kind of like this very complex, layered, almost like a paradox.
Yeah, or I think what you're talking about is it's reinforcing in the short term. So if I achieve and I get an award, say, or I get a promotion or whatever it is, then in that moment I get that relief. Okay, phew, I've proven that I'm enough. But that wears off over time. And now what I've taught myself is the only way that I can get rid of my self-doubt is if I get another achievement. But then that wears off, right? And so it's this cycle, not unlike drugs or alcohol, right? It's like I have a drink and I feel better, and then I don't feel so good anymore. So then I have another drink and I feel better. And so, I think it's very similar to that. Is the more I achieve, the more I have to achieve in this effort of outrunning the imposter phenomenon, but it doesn't stick.
I love that description. And I think at one point, Dr. Jill, I did hear somebody call it an addiction of performance, or that's what it sounds like to me. It's almost like an addictive behavior, but it's to external validation or performance. So fascinating. So let's dig into this whole idea of why pop culture calls it a syndrome. And in your book, you really call out that, no, it's a phenomenon. And I will just add that I love that, because I feel like labels actually can do more harm in many ways than actually be helpful.
Absolutely. I totally agree. If someone tells you you have a syndrome, they're essentially saying you have a disorder, a disease, this pathology that needs to be fixed. And, when this phenomenon was identified in the late 70s by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, two psychologists, they called it the imposter phenomenon. It was never meant to be called a syndrome. And what I think is really fascinating and sad, actually, is at that time, they believed that it only affected high achieving women. Of course, we now know that's not true, but at the time, that's what was believed. And so they identify this phenomenon that is affecting these badass women who might actually go achieve a thing or two in their life. And what happens? Our culture, society decides, must be a syndrome. We're going to call it imposter syndrome. And what a clever way to try to keep those high achieving women down. Mm-hmm. So there's sexism baked right in to that term. So
that's so
yes, there's there's just that sexism baked right in. And so to me, that's the number one reason we should not be calling it a syndrome, because it was never meant to be, and because it got rebranded because it's sexist. But the other thing is that, now it's interesting, if you Google imposter syndrome, you get hundreds of millions of hits. But if you search a scientific database, it's hundreds of hits. So there's really not actually a whole lot of good science around this. There's a little bit, but not much. And the prevalence rates vary very widely. So I've seen as low as 9% in some samples and as high as 86%. But most studies show it's somewhere between 40 and 70. So essentially that means about half of us are going to experience these thoughts and feelings at some point. Again, do you know of any other disease or disorder or pathology that affects half the humans on the planet? No, that's not a thing. So really, this is normal. If it affects that many of us, it's normal. So it's not a syndrome? And then this is an empirical question that is yet to be answered. But I think the other possibility and the other reason that we shouldn't call it a syndrome is, it doesn't affect everyone. So of course we ask like, well, who are these lucky people who never feel this way? Like I remember telling my dad I was writing my book and he's like, imposter syndrome, what the heck is that? And he's a cis straight white guy who's educated and has all the privilege and whatnot. And I thought for sure once I explained what it was, he would recognize it. He just didn't know what it was called. And he was like dumbfounded. He had like absolutely no idea what I was talking about. And so I think the other thing that happens is the people that are most vulnerable to having these thoughts and feelings are people who have some experience of marginalization or being othered in some way. So it's not that it can't affect cis straight white men. My husband is in that category, but he grew up poor. No one in his family was educated. He was very tiny like stature wise, he was tiny. He got bullied a lot. So I think, any experience of really being othered, getting a message, whether it's overtly or covertly, that you don't belong at all the tables is going to make you more likely to question whether you belong at those tables. And so to me, that's another reason this is not a pathology, because it really may stem out of experiences of oppression.
Yeah, well, I love that. And I mean, two things stand out to me with what you just said, Dr. Jill. The first is that if it really was a pathology or a syndrome, then it would be like a global epidemic because we have so many people, right? That it's like, we need to take care of this. This is worse than cancer type thing, right? And I'm not trying to make light of that, but it's fascinating to me that pop culture still calls it a syndrome, even though it's not. The other element is, people who have been marginalized and felt less than in some way or another tend to be maybe more susceptible to this. One thing I've noticed, because I do a lot of emotional intelligence work and emotional intelligence psychometric assessments with my clients, is that almost every client that is considered what would be higher on the empathy scale seems to have it. So I'm curious if you know of any connection or what connection you would maybe make with that data.
That's interesting. I have not heard that before. So I'd have to think about it. But if we think of empathy as like, I am good at perspective taking, I am good at kind of putting myself in other people's shoes and understanding what their experience is. I don't know why those two things would be correlated. It's not obvious to me. It's going to be chugging in my brain for hours and hours and hours. So I'll have to reach back out to you if I suddenly have an aha moment.
And maybe it's not correlated, but if you get any ahas, I'd love to dig into that a little more.
That's really interesting.
One thing that you mentioned already, and I'd love for you to talk more about in detail because you talk about it in your book, and I knew this subconsciously, but it really didn't hit me until I read your book, is the concept that you can never outachieve it. You can never outachieve imposter phenomenon. And I even get the chills as I'm telling you it now because it really deeply rests in my soul because I lived so much of my life that way.
Yeah. And I think of this as kind of bad news, good news. It's like at first you hear it and you're like, oh, that's soul crushing. You mean I'm never going to be able to get rid of it? But on the other hand, it can also be very freeing because if it's not going to go away, then what you can learn to do instead of struggling so hard to try to make it go away is like learn to just kind of have it be like your sidekick, or I think of it as like, a backseat driver in the back of your car. Like they may have a lot to say about the way you're driving, but you're the one that has the hands on the wheel that's deciding where you go and how fast you get there. And you don't need to pull over and kick that backseat driver out because then you're no longer driving. You're focusing too much on fighting not to have it, but instead like just keep driving the car and you're on your journey, your adventure, and it can talk in the background. It's fine. You can choose not to listen.
Choice is so important. And I love that.
Yeah.
You also talk about this idea of whose voice is it when you're hearing the imposter or you're getting these thoughts or feelings. And because of my background, I've done a lot of inner child work. And so to me, it's been really fascinating at times when I hear it. Is it a parent that's disapproving or nothing's ever good enough? Or is it my inner child saying, I can't do that. I can't do that. I'm not good enough.
Interesting.
And so I love that you called out this idea of like really paying attention to whose voice it is that you're hearing.
Yeah. And I think what you're probably alluding to is I talk in the book about like, where does this come from? Like, okay, so we're already saying it's pretty normal. It affects so many people, but it doesn't affect everyone. So who is more vulnerable? And we talked about this kind of, if you've been othered, you might be more vulnerable. But I honestly think that this is evolutionary. So if you think, like, I genuinely think this is baked into us, because if you think about early humans, I don't know, 100,000 years ago, early humans didn't have sharp uh, claws. They didn't have fangs. They didn't run at high speeds. They had each other. And we know that early humans who hunted and gathered and traveled together had a survival advantage. And so how do you make sure that you're going to stay connected to that tribe? You're going to make sure that you're thinking, do I add value? Am I bringing something to this group? If they find out I'm not pulling my weight, or they think I'm not doing well enough, they're going to kick me out and I'm going to be dead. And so having that worry that you are enough and that you're not going to be revealed as a fraud, essentially, had a survival advantage. And so then that means the fittest who survived are those who were more likely to have that kind of narrative going on behind the scenes. And then, of course, our learning histories can impact this too, right? If you've got parents who are very critical, like I said, if you've had these experiences of being othered, any number of experiences can kind of rear that little inner critic up. But a lot of that is having some form of inner critic, even if it's not an imposter voice, appears to be a pretty universal experience. And if that's the case, evolution is very elegant. Like, it would have gotten rid of it if we didn't need it for some reason. And so if you think about all the mean things your inner critic says, typically it's trying to help you. It's trying to protect you from rejection or humiliation or failure, something of that nature. And that's what your inner imposter voice is doing too. And so, going back to what we were saying before, it's not about trying to get rid of it. It's like if a skunk wanted to get rid of its smell, you'd be like, that's ridiculous. Like, the smell is protecting it against predators, and all skunks have that smell. Well, if all humans have an inner critic, then it's kind of ridiculous to think that we should work so hard to change it or get rid of it. And I mean, if you can, great, good on you. But I've been trying for, 25 years and I haven't been able to do it. So then I think the alternative is you really just change your relationship to that voice instead.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what I was hearing, and how you described it was, okay, it becomes about how do we work with it and partner with it. So let's go into that. What are the recommendations you would have for us listeners?
Yeah. So all of the work I do, whether I'm doing keynotes, webinars, workshops, the podcast, in my therapy and coaching, all the books I write, they all center on one thing, and that's psychological flexibility. And this is a construct. It's an evidence-based, empirically supported construct that we know is a predictor of physical and mental health and well-being. And what psychological flexibility means is it is our ability to be in this present moment, because that's the only one we've got, aware of and open to all of our internal experiences. So that's our thoughts, our emotions, our physical feelings, our urges, all the stuff that's going on inside. So we're aware of all that stuff. We're open and allowing it to be present, to just be as it is, without doing anything to avoid, escape, control, push away, or grasp on. I mean, even if it's an internal experience we want to have more of, but we're just letting things be as they are. And then we're making conscious, deliberate choices to act in values congruent ways. And so what I like to call, what does that mean? Values congruent? It's being the me you want to be. And if we want to add that present moment, the me you want to be in each moment. And the reason I add that is because if you think about the actual word moment, like if you picture it spelled out, the word me is right in the center. So who is the me you want to be in this one moment? And even when your mind says you have no business doing this, you have nothing valuable to share, or you're feeling anxious, can you choose to show up as that me, even in the presence of those difficult internal experiences?
You just blew my mind. I love that. I had not thought of that, but what a great visual. I am a very visual person. And so I love that, the idea of
and I think what's also important to add to that, we've all been kind of sold this bill of goods that we should be able to like make ourselves happy all the time, but it's ridiculous.
Right.
Because think about the last time you were laying awake at 2 a.m. and your wheels are spinning and you can't get back to sleep. We've all been there, right? Think about whatever it was that you were worrying about. And I'm going to guess it wasn't that Game of Thrones isn't coming back for another season, even if it was your favorite show, right? You're probably worrying about being competent at work, your relationships, your health, the state of the world. It's things that you care about. And so if we're going to show up and do things that are challenging, that we care about doing well, we're going to have some anxiety or worry or self-doubt. That's normal. That's normal. And so
Completely
this
normal.
idea that we have to wait until we feel confident, ready, skilled, expert enough, whatever the enough is, might mean that we're waiting forever. And I actually, in the book, I call that the gap trap. So we get trapped in stagnation due to a perceived gap in knowledge or skill or expertise or ability or confidence. And we believe we have to fill the gap before we move forward with the thing, which of course is a trap. And that really what psychological flexibility is all about is, can I show up and do this thing that matters to me? Can I be the me I want to be, even when my inner critic and inner imposter voice say that I can't and shouldn't, and even when I'm filled with fear and self-doubt?
That is such a valuable tool. Just how you described it verbally and then the visual that goes with that flexibility model for me. I hope listeners agree. I'm sure they will. It was just highly valuable to hear you talk through that because I've never really thought about it in terms of the caring component.
Mm-hmm.
And then I knew there was a gap, but I think because of, again, my history, I've always felt like, well, you're just dumb if you don't know how to fill it, or you're dumb or wrong for not already having those skills. And it's like, well, how are we supposed to learn and grow? The example I like to use is we don't ever expect a baby just to be able to crawl or walk. They have to try several times and fail, and then they eventually do it, and we're all cheering them on. We don't sit there and judge them. So why are we doing
you're
that
not
to
like,
ourselves?
You stupid baby.
Right.
You're doing such a bad job walking.
Right.
Which is what we do say to ourselves when we're not perfect. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that would be, I still would not have launched this podcast if that was the case, because I was waiting for it to be right. I was waiting to have more information. I was waiting to write my book. I wouldn't have reached out to you and felt confident in having this conversation because I was putting so much pressure on myself to have all the answers and know more, instead of really taking a model of curiosity and just compassion for myself and saying, okay, there's a lot I can add to this conversation. I'm also a really good facilitator and I really care about people and I'm genuinely curious. Why not just reach out and invite the experts on, and I can learn in front of the world and they can learn with me.
Well, and what comes to mind for me is like, and I think it's a helpful mantra for any of us, is like, I don't have to know everything. I just have to know enough. And like, do you know enough to get started on your podcast? Yes. And then you will continue to learn as you go because you don't know what you don't know. And it often really requires doing to figure that out and to improve and to get better.
Absolutely. And what stood out to me as you just said that was the concept of care enough to be curious.
Yeah.
Right?
I love that. That's great.
And lean into that instead of the judgment.
Yeah.
Right. That we often have. I know you also wrote a book on the metaphors, and I'd love to talk about that. And then if there's any correlation, in the world of Carl Jung and I am statements and whatnot to this idea of imposter phenomenon.
Yeah. So psychological flexibility is the goal of acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's a good segue because I think when I start to talk about this, like we have to be willing to do it scared, people are like, yeah, okay, easier said than done. Like I hear you, but I feel like I can't. Like it just feels like it's too big of a mountain for people to. And so with acceptance and commitment therapy, we're building psychological flexibility. And then the way that we're doing that is through some core processes. One is identifying your values and then, walking that walk. And then the rest is, okay, but what do I do with this internal, Jill, you said I changed my relationship to it. What does that mean? How do I do that? You're telling me I can't get rid of it. So what do I do instead? And so one of those concepts or core processes is called acceptance, or it's also called willingness. It's the acceptance part of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And the way I always describe it with clients is it's just getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And so it's not like, okay, Jill said I have to do it scared. So now I'm going to go get on stage in front of 1,000 people and do a keynote. It's if you told me like, I really have a goal. I'd like to run a marathon. And I said, oh, great. Are you a runner? No. Then you wouldn't go do 26.2 this weekend. You would train. You'd start walking around the block and then jogging. And over time, you would build up your speed and your distance and all the things. And so I think of willingness in exactly the same way. You can practice getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And so we can do a really easy one right now that listeners can do too, as long as they're not driving, is if you just fold your hands the way that feels comfortable, where you're interlacing fingers, and notice how that feels. And now just switch it so it's one finger off.
Oh, so weird.
Right? It's weird. It
so
feels
weird.
Funny.
I almost had to look.
Yes. Notice how it feels. Notice how you don't like how it feels. Notice the urge to switch back or to let go, because that's the thing we often respond to on autopilot. We just naturally dive for the comfort zone. And can you open and breathe and allow? And then I always give people this, it's like a 5-part mantra that if you can kind of bring this to your relationship to your discomfort, truly, it changes everything. So everyone can kind of repeat after me as they're listening. So this is uncomfortable.
This is uncomfortable.
But it's just a feeling.
But it's just a feeling.
It is not dangerous.
It is not dangerous.
It is temporary.
It is temporary.
And I can handle it.
And I can handle it.
Right? So that's that and I don't mean to be invalidating when I say it's just a feeling. Of course, if someone's having a panic attack, it's awful, right? It feels really, really bad. And it is still a feeling that is temporary, that is not dangerous, that you can handle. And as we have more of that willingness, think about how many decisions you make because you don't want to feel a certain way. And that if I could wave a wand and take that away, or you were just able to feel all the things, think of the uncomfortable or difficult conversations that you would have. Think about the opportunities that would open. Think, the things that you just stop avoiding, or the overachieving, like getting off that hamster wheel that leads us to burnout because we're trying so hard to prove ourselves. It would literally change everything if we weren't letting our feelings take the wheel and steer. So that's kind of the biggest thing that that's what I find to be the most impactful thing that I teach whenever I'm giving talks, trainings, therapy. And then the other piece is, what do we do with our thoughts? And that's really that imposter, right? Who do you think you are? You have no business. Yours probably said, who do you think you are to write a book? You're not a book author. Who do you think you are to start a podcast? You don't know anything about podcasts, right? And yet here you are.
Yep.
Running a podcast and writing a book. And so and I bet you didn't get rid of that voice. I bet that voice is still there. And yet here you still are. Would that be accurate?
It is. I think what happened in my case is I got so sick. This last summer, I had a near-death experience. And that experience changed my perspective of fear. Where after going through something like that, I realized a few people not liking my book or thinking I can't do it, or haters out there, is nothing compared to what just happened to me.
Yeah. Well, then that tells me you got connected to your values, because what I hear inside of that is this just isn't that important. And your values are about, what would you make important if your thoughts and feelings weren't in charge of what you were doing? And there were things in your life that when you were faced with not having a life anymore, that you got some clarity about what really matters. And it's not that voice telling you can't.
Yeah.
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 That's amazing.
When I came home, I'm a spiritual person, so I believe it really came from God, this whole thing. And obviously even me being here still, but I came home and I remember telling my husband, why did I almost have to die to finally recognize that I'm worthy to be here? And so that's what sort of popped it for me, was okay, I don't want anyone else to feel this way. I have to get this message out. I have to meet with experts like you, Dr. Jill, to spread this word. So we can normalize this feeling and realize that there's this psychological flexibility, all these things you're talking about, to help people realize there's nothing wrong with them and they don't have to hide it. We can talk about it.
Totally. Yes. And I think, you're talking about trying to transform your pain into a purpose. And, a lot of the values exercises that we do in acceptance and commitment therapy are kind of facing mortality types of exercises. So for example, we might do a perspective taking exercise that's imagine yourself at the very end of a long life and, someone is giving your eulogy. What would you want them to say about the way they lived your life? And I actually like to do that as a 2-parter. One is, you're 100, what would they say? The other is, if this were today, what would they say?
I got the chills.
Right? And then you look at the difference between those things. And in that gap, that's the work. You're here and you want to go here. So now let's talk about what to do. Let's talk about what's getting in the way, really, in terms of your thoughts and your feelings, and how you can shift your relationship to those thoughts and feelings so that you can be that 100-year-old that you want people to talk about at your eulogy. Or the other one I love is in kind of like a gravestone or epitaph exercise. And I love it because, a eulogy is long. This would take a whole session to kind of do this, but we can just say okay, well, what would you want your gravestone to say? And you can do this as kind of a global message or in one area. So for example, what I don't want it to say is, here lies Jill. She always played it safe so that she would never have to endure rejection or failure. That sounds like such a small life, right? What I want it to say is, here lies Jill. She took risks and it didn't always go her way and that hurt, but she lived boldly or with courage or something like that. In a domain, if I'm being really honest, what it kind of would say right now is in the parenting domain, here lies Jill. Whenever she is tired and irritable, she tends to snap at her children. And that's not really the mom I want to be. And, going back to the me inside the moment, the word mom is also in the word moment. And so I often ask myself, what kind of mom do I want to be in this moment? Right. And so I want my epitaph to say, here lies Jill. Even when she was tired and irritable, she still treated her children with love and respect and kindness. And I fail at that a lot. And even though I've been doing this for 25 years, we are all works in progress. None of the things we're talking about today have an end point. Like, you don't check off your list like, oh, I'm psychologically flexible now. They're all processes that we have to return to again and again and again and again, and we'll fail a lot, but the next moment is another chance to do it right. So what I end up doing is apologizing to my kids a lot when I'm not able to control that snap right in the moment, but then I'm still showing up in that next moment as the mom I want to be, the person who's taking responsibility and being loving and kind and trying to show up as the best mom I can in that next one, because there's always, a next one.
Thank you for that example. I completely relate as a mother of two teenage boys, and I think a lot of the listeners will find a lot of goodness in that, because it can be a challenge to be a parent, long days of work, and we're not our best selves. And so taking that idea, one thing I find, and it's a challenge, is when I deal with, it's mostly executives. I'll say it's mostly executives at Fortune 50 companies who are very highly accomplished, and they just aren't used to failing. And if they do, they clean it up quick and move on. I find they're the hardest to open up to this idea that it's normal or okay to have self-doubt. They always seem to kind of have to rewrite history like it was always part of the plan, instead of just saying, ooh, I'm a little doubtful, but I commit that I will be transparent with you about the best next step. And here's what I think the next best step is, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's possible. I mean, if you're talking about cis straight white men who haven't had a history of being othered or marginalized, they very well may not. Like, I gave you the example of my dad, and he's a CEO and entrepreneur, and he genuinely does not experience this. I went to a doctor, a dermatologist guy, and he's asking me questions, and I tell him about the book, and he too was like, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And so it's certainly that a lot of the people you're talking about genuinely don't have this experience, or at least have a hard time accessing it. And I do think, for the rest where they're having it, but maybe don't want to admit it, I think that comes from a place of like, if I tell you I'm afraid of being outed as a fraud, it's the same thing as me confessing to you that I am a fraud, because that's the belief, right? It's, I think that I am not actually as smart or competent or whatever as other people think I am. And I'm terrified they're going to find out. And so if I admit, oh, this is my fear, I'm essentially outing myself, because people don't recognize you're not actually a fraud. You're having this imposter experience that are just these thoughts and feelings that come along when you do something challenging that you care about doing well. And it's normal. And I think the best thing we can do, which you and I are doing right now on this podcast, is to talk openly about it. And I was sharing with you before we hit record that I often have leaders ask me, how can I best be of help to my team when they share with me that they're experiencing this? And I say the answer is to answer them, me too. Not to lie if you really haven't had that experience, but if you have ever experienced self-doubt or fear that people are going to figure out that you're not as competent as they think you are, share that. Share it. It's the most powerful thing that you can do. In fact, you asked me at the very top about how I kind of got into this and why I wanted to write the book. I was at a conference years ago, and I moderated a panel on the imposter experience. And I got 4 really badass, successful women to be on the panel. And I just talked a little bit about the definition and the subtypes and whatnot. It was a little, 5-10 minute thing. And then they all just shared their story. And everybody was bawling, crying. It was very vulnerable and emotional and authentic and amazing. And my hope was that at the end, people who attended would go, wait, what? You? How is it possible that you're this successful and you have these thoughts and feelings too? To make it click that people are not fixing this and then succeeding. They're changing their relationship to it so that it is not in charge of what they're choosing to do. And so they're moving forward with their goals and dreams and aspirations, even in the presence of these thoughts and feelings. And that is precisely what happened. That is exactly the feedback that we got from everyone. And it was such an aha moment of like, these are really successful leaders and pillars in this community. And them talking about it essentially gave every other person permission to go after the life that they wanted, even though they felt like they didn't have a right to do so.
Yeah. So much of it comes down to permission. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, at least in my experience, I didn't realize I need it until somebody gives it to me. And then I'm like, oh, I just felt like I lost 10 pounds, you know?
And can I give it to myself instead next time? Yeah.
Yes. It's such a powerful tool. And I think that's so helpful talking about the leadership lens through just telling them to be vulnerable. I mean, Brene Brown talks about that all the time, right? And the power of vulnerability. And that's one thing I'm hoping to do with this podcast and intend to do is just building authentic conversations around this, because my theory going into this, my hypothesis, which you just confirmed for me, was that what makes a leader great isn't because they don't have self-doubt or maybe they don't have imposter experiences. It's that they lead anyway. They lead in spite of it.
Exactly.
And take on this ACT model you're talking about, right? This acceptance, commitment, and they don't let it paralyze them.
Yep. That's right. And I think the other piece that's really critically important here is we now have over 8 decades of research. Like I don't know if you're familiar with, it used to be called the Harvard Men's Study. That's how old it is, but it's the longest longitudinal study that's ever been done. And they used to compare men in the slums of Boston to men at Harvard. And now, of course, they have women and whatnot, but this study is still ongoing.
Wow.
And they've looked at like literally every variable you could ever possibly imagine and how these things predict well-being, physical health, morbidity, mortality, etc. And they have found again and again and again, there is one thing that predicts all of it more strongly than anything else. Do you know what it is?
Community, belonging.
Yep. That's exactly right.
Well, where I got that was the Blue Zone. I don't know if you watched the Blue Zones on Netflix, but I thought that was fascinating.
That's right.
And
that's right.
And so that's where I kind of pieced it together was that
it's the presence of quality relationships. And so doesn't it make sense if you think about what's at the root of that imposter experience? I don't want other people to find me out because that threatens my bond with them. Even if it's like a coworker or a boss, like they might not be your BFF, but it's still a human bond, right? That we care about.
Yes.
And going back to what you were saying about this, like people, when they think they can't admit they're struggling and they have to show up as this perfect, specimen. When have you ever bonded with someone who's perfect? Perfect people suck, right? Like it's impossible to feel connected to someone if they're not flawed in some way. And so I think, and that's going back to the Brene Brown and the vulnerability and all of it. And in fact, I don't know the details of the study. I should go back and look at it. It's been a long time, but there's some study where they did this experimentally and looked at like essentially how likable someone is if they actually like spill mustard on their shirt or, somebody who's got this like high status, but then does something kind of like oafy or bumbling. And of course, people are more likable that way.
Oh my gosh, my son would be very likable.
There you go. Right. Well, because otherwise it's intimidating. Like one of my closest friends, when we first became friends, she invited me to her house for the first time. And she was just kind of like, oh, sorry, I didn't clean. And I was like, oh, thank God her house is in the exact same state as mine. And it was not perfect. And it made me feel so much closer to her that she would show me those warts and that she had them just like me.
Yeah.
And whereas I grew up with a mother who was like, would have been mortified by this. Like she would have made sure I cleaned every single dust bunny out of that house before I let someone through the door.
Yeah.
But I think we've had that all wrong.
I totally agree. One of the things I do in my other job is I am a keynote coach at a very large company. And one of the things I get them to work on is don't portray the ivory tower experience. You need to be relatable and likable. And you want people to leave the keynote saying, I'd love to go have a coffee or a beer with Dr. Jill and just learn more. That is a win. You don't want them leaving thinking, well, he's the smartest person in the room. I mean, that's a great compliment.
And I can never live up to that.
That's right.
Right? It's more like, just like the imposter panel is like, oh, if this person who's a really good speaker, who's teaching me this cool thing, is also a human who has flaws and pain and traumatic experiences in their background or whatever it is they're talking about, then like I can achieve those things too. You have to be able to see it to believe you can be it. And that means being a full human. And we all have the warts, right?
That's right. That's right. So I love that about what you just shared, because I can take that into my other work. And I think it's super powerful to just keep repeating the message around authenticity and imperfection.
Vulnerability. Yes,
vulnerability.
exactly.
Imperfection is the new normal, right? That's my mantra. And I love that so much. Let's talk about your third book. You have another book called, I'm going to blank on the
Be
name.
Mighty.
Jill, thank you.
Yep, Be
Help me.
Mighty. That one's also an ACT book. So that's a self-help, or so what do they call it now? Self-development, I think, is the new term for self-help. But it's a personal development book for women with anxiety, worry, and stress. So the first book you were asking me about is really just for ACT therapists. So anyone who's doing acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's all, the therapy is very experiential, like how we did the hand thing, the folding hands thing. And so that's all metaphors and exercises for identifying values and for learning how to practice willingness for therapists. The second one, Be Mighty, is for women with anxiety, worry, and stress. And then that's learning about ACT, psychological flexibility, with practices for how to change your relationship to your thoughts and feelings so you can live a valued life. And then the third one is same thing. I mean, not the same thing, but for professionals who struggle with the imposter experience. And so it's all like my mission, everything I do is, if I could just teach the world psychological flexibility, we'd be like good to go. So
I'm
that's
so
what that one is.
Glad that you're here to do that with us here today. And I just think there's so much that we can do on that topic. It's such a liberating feeling now that I've heard you explain it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was asked, in fact, I'm doing this for the third time next week. I was asked to speak at it's like a big conference for teens related to mental health. And so they asked me to come speak, and they said, we want you to give them something they can take away, like something actionable that will improve their mental health and reduce their vulnerability to suicide. And you have 35 minutes. And I was like,
That's
okay. See, it felt like an impossible tall order. And then pretty quickly I was like, oh no, I know exactly what I'll teach them. And it's getting comfortable being uncomfortable.
That's right.
This wasn't my idea. This came from someone in a consultation group with me, but I thought it was the best willingness practice. I handed out to all the teens. I gave them a little square of bubble wrap. And I said, now put your thumb on the bubble and don't pop it. And it was so cute. They were like, you're so mean. They were so mad because that's a really hard. And the talk was basically about impulsivity, right? How often do you like whip off that impulsive text message and then regret it because it blows up your relationship or whatever? And so it was about learning how to sit with an urge and not react in that autopilot impulsive way. Like, can you notice that feeling of like, oh my God, I want to pop this thing so bad, and sit and open and allow. It's uncomfortable. It's just a feeling. It's not dangerous. It's temporary and I can handle it. And there are a zillion ways people can do this. There's, you could just like take a shower a little bit too hot or too cold. You can do anything with your non-dominant hand, brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand. I like, if I have cash in my wallet, I like it to be in denominational order, all facing the same way. Cause I'm not a psychopath.
I do the same thing.
Of course. And you will never find the money in my wallet that way, ever. Because every single time I look at that as an opportunity to practice being uncomfortable. I've been doing it for 25 years and I still look for these opportunities to be uncomfortable every single day, because you build up this ability the same way you build up muscles. And then it gets a lot easier to do the hard thing. And usually I have people start practicing with their senses. Like if I showed you in my desk drawer, I have Bean Boozled jelly beans. Do you know what those are? They're the ones like, so I'll do this with clients online and we'll like spin the spinner and it's, the pink speckled one, and it might be strawberry banana smoothie or it might be vomit flavored.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's just a jelly bean. And so it's this great way to practice sitting with discomfort and opening and allowing, and it's kind of fun. And then it helps your relationship because you kind of have like a trauma bond at that point because it's so unpleasant. And you can work your way up. You can watch like the last 5 minutes of Marley and Me on YouTube. That's a killer. You could like listen to a politician you hate. And remember now, acceptance isn't like I accept what this person is saying. It's I'm deliberately using stimuli to trigger discomfort inside my skin so that I can practice being with the discomfort that's in my skin without having to do anything to try to control it.
Yeah.
So there's loads of ways.
I love the small examples you gave because those for anyone listening probably feel more manageable without risking relationships, jobs, before you move into those bigger things. I know for me, what really taught me the best way of discomfort and getting comfortable with it was yoga and meditation, because sometimes you have to hold the poses for a long time, or in meditation, it's the discomfort of and getting comfortable in that discomfort and trying to quiet your mind was so challenging. But what's
Yes.
interesting is I noticed within about a month of practicing meditation and yoga 7 days a week, I found myself in meetings and not having the same reaction to certain personality types or triggers, and actually not quieting my voice, actually speaking up and being able to do it with clarity in situations that would normally shut me down. So I found it very empowering.
I love that. And the other thing you're doing, you're not just making space for discomfort, but I bet, like in those poses in meditation, your mind is going nuts and your
It is.
mind is probably saying, I can't do this. I can't hold this any longer. This is too hard. And that then there you are. And that's another practice we can all do is like if everyone raises their hand like this, I mean, they can't see me on video, but I'm just raising my right hand like in a classroom, and then say, I can't raise my hand. Wow, look at that. It's just a demonstration of like you can think one way and still choose to act another. And that's part of the key with the thinking piece is if I listen to this thought, is it going to move me in the direction of being the me I want to be in this moment? Or
That's
is it
right.
going to move me away? And sometimes like your inner critic might be helpful. Like, so let's say my inner critic was saying, Jill, you were kind of a bad mom last night. You really had your face in your phone when your kids were trying to get your attention. Yeah, that's a mean voice, but guess what? It's actually telling me something important that I was acting in ways that aren't consistent with my values. So I'm going to actually go ahead and listen to that one and be more present with my kids today. But if that voice is saying, you're such a terrible mother, you should just abandon your family and move to another country because they're better off without you, I'm not going to listen to that one because abandoning my children is not consistent with my values. And I know it's kind of an extreme example, but sometimes
Right.
our inner critics can be very extreme. And so in that space, can I get some distance from those thoughts? Can I look at them and notice, like you can be like a curious, dispassionate observer, almost like an anthropologist. I'm just here to look at my thoughts, not get enmeshed with them. Just like an anthropologist doesn't interact with, the tribe that they're observing, for example. And so can I notice those thoughts and then just decide if I listen, is it going to move me in the direction I want to go or not? And if not, then, I was giving the metaphor of the backseat driver. Like the voice isn't going to shut up. It's going to sit back there and still try to command you, but you can still choose to keep your hands on that wheel and driving in the direction of your values, irrespective of what your mind has to say about it.
I love that because there's the element of control, and then going back to what you said earlier around safety. And, it connects deeply with psychological safety, and even to the comment you made about how we're tribal people. And that's how, thousands of years ago, that's how, or longer, that's how things have really manifested, and how we were determined as worthy or contributors to our community. And it's all about, what am I contributing, and do I feel seen, heard, and respected, right? Which is psychological safety. So I love that element because by realizing that you can have some semblance of control in what you choose to act on or listen to, and which thoughts you're going to give attention to, then it gives you this element of safety. And for me, I know that's one of my big triggers, my value
Yeah,
triggers.
that's an interesting take. And speaking to this idea of control,
Yeah.
we don't control our thoughts and feelings. Those just show up for all sorts of different reasons, but we do get to control how we respond. And really, and when it comes to values, like values have to be something that you can control. So like sometimes I'll have people say like, well, I value being calm or peace. And like, well, good luck with that because things aren't always calm and you're not always going to feel calm. So that's not actually a value. You can value acting patiently even when you don't feel patient. But really the only thing we can control are our hands and our feet and our mouths. That's it. That's
Mm-hmm.
it. It's like we can, what we do or what we don't do, what we say or what we don't say. We don't control the thoughts and the feelings. But if we can get better at being open and aware, it creates space so that we can get off that reactive autopilot and choose to show up in more values driven ways. And, one of the ways we can create space with these imposter thoughts and feelings is, so this is actually a quick exercise that we can do is like, so if you say to yourself, something like I'm not good enough or I'm a fraud or whatever your thing is, like whatever that thought is that tends to give you the most trouble. So if listeners, like I want listeners to think about like, what is the thought that gives you trouble? And so let's say I'll do, I'm not good enough. And so say the thought to yourself or out loud, doesn't matter. And notice how it feels. I'm not good enough. Now try, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough.
I'm having the thought I'm not good enough.
Now try, I'm noticing I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough.
I'm noticing I'm having the thought I'm not good enough.
And so what happens as you do that?
So when I said I'm not good enough, I felt it in my stomach, like deep into my gut. Okay. And then when I said I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, it elevated in my heart. And then when I said I'm noticing I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, it was just all up here.
Or in your head. Yeah,
So I
that's
felt
so
like it was almost
interesting.
like
Yes, it was
rising
like
up.
coming out the top of your head.
Yeah.
Yes. And like, so
Blowing smoke.
people tend to experience like a distancing, and it doesn't make the pain go away. It doesn't make the thought go away, but it's creating a little more distance. So now you're like, oh, this is just a thought. Like, this isn't a truth with a capital T. This isn't, I don't have to listen to this. And there's loads of actually fun ways you can do it. You can sing it. You can put it in like a Google Translate, and notice how if you say, I'm not good enough in your native language, it feels terrible, but put it in a language you don't speak and suddenly it has absolutely no meaning. But it means the same thing, right? So that means you're the one giving it the power.
Right.
And what we know is that the more we try to suppress, like right now, if you try as hard as you possibly can to not think of a red balloon, we're all going to start thinking about red balloons. And you might go like, I'm looking at my desk, like black coffee cup, so that I don't think of a red balloon. But eventually the red balloon will start like flying up behind the coffee cup. And people can try this on their own, but there's lots of research that shows we might be able to push the thought away for a short time, but typically it then comes back with more vengeance. Same with our feelings.
Right.
And so, instead we want to like let it be present and let go of that like struggle to fight it, because it takes so much of our time and effort and energy and attention so that we're not able to do other things. And if we can let that stuff be present, we can be more focused on showing up in those values consistent ways.
Yeah, I love that idea because two things stood out to me, Dr. Jill. The first was that as you described it and went through that exercise, it changed it from me being the one experiencing it to me being the observer.
Yes,
which distances
exactly
like
right.
creates that distance that you described. So
Exactly
it's like, oh, okay. It's almost like the inner child versus the parent, right? At least in my case, it's like, okay, oh, I'm feeling this and I'm feeling, ugh. Okay. As the observer, it's like I'm the guardian, or my, angel or whatever you want to call it. Right. And I'm able to say, oh no, I'm observing that, but it doesn't mean anything, right? It gives me that agency that I think I was looking for. And then the last piece that I think is quite interesting is, it relates back to the conversation around leaders and some of their challenges and struggles in this area. I think that's so common that leaders are not allowing themselves to, again, give themselves permission, but use these tools that you're giving us to actually be the observer and slow down. Because what I find is that this self-doubt kind of starts and then grows over time. They don't just wake up one day feeling like an imposter. I feel like it's something that kind of brews for a while. And again, I have no scientific evidence to prove this, but it seems like, oh no, once we unpack it, it's like, oh, this has been kind of going on for a while, but I've been ignoring it. I've been shoving it down and not addressing it. But all these tools you're giving us here today just allow them the freedom and permission to address it. So hopefully it never gets to that point where you suddenly have full-blown imposter syndrome and it paralyzes you. So thank you for that.
I hope so.
Yeah, no, this has been amazing. This has been amazing for me, and I know for all the listeners. What would you love to see happen with this topic? You already alluded to the fact that you want to make everyone aware of psychological flexibility. What would you love to see happen, and what would be an action that I could take and the listeners could take to help you?
Well, the reason I started out as a therapist. I'm a psychologist and I was primarily doing clinical work, and I was a professor for about 9 years. So I was like, teaching and doing clinical work. And at one point, and then I went into full-time clinical work, and I thought, it just feels really bad that the only people who have access to this are people with the resources to afford individual therapy. And it's expensive, and insurance is terrible. And I don't actually take insurance. And so it really became my professional mission to try to share this in ways that it would be more accessible. So books are inexpensive, podcasts are free. And so what I've really been working on more recently is trying to do more and more speaking, because you reach more people. And while the corporations pay for speakers, the staff, the attendees are typically not paying. That's typically free for them. And so that's like most of my teaching used to be more with mental health professionals. And now I'm trying to get out much more into the public. And it's amazing. It is so rewarding when like a person who's never heard any of this, just you can see these like mic drop moments because people don't, this is so counterintuitive. Everything else that's out there, literally every other book or blog or whatever that you find on the whole imposter experience is about building your confidence and thinking positive. And it's about trying to control these internal experiences. And so then when that fails, now you still feel like an imposter and you feel like a failure because you weren't able to combat it effectively. And what I hear from people with psychological flexibility is like how freeing and empowering it is to go, I don't have to keep struggling to get rid of this. Like I can just live my life and like learn how to let it be present. And so my goal is to get out on as many stages and into as many like public spaces that I can be sharing this with more people so that it's getting outside of mental health and into just the regular vernacular. The other question you asked is like, what can you do and what can listeners do? I think the best thing is to start those practices. Like look for opportunities to practice sitting with discomfort, do the things that scare you and really pay attention. So what we know predicts new learning is when your mind predicts something, but then your experience disproves it. So if my mind says, I couldn't come on this podcast and do a good job or something, and then I do it, and after you're like, that's great. If you pay attention to that, oh, I thought I was going to fail, but it actually went well. The more you have those experiences, the more your brain goes, oh, maybe this isn't so dangerous after all. And so it gets easier. Essentially facing your fear over and over, the thing you're afraid of stops being quite so scary. So the more you are willing to do the hard, scary thing, the easier it's going to get. It'll never be easy because if it's challenging and you care about doing it well, you will likely still have some feelings about it, and that's okay. But the more you do it, the easier it does become, the easier the willingness even becomes. Even if you're still feeling anxious, you're much better at letting anxiety be present when you're doing the thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been so valuable. Where can people find you? On social?
The best place? Yeah, probably my website is jillstoddard.com. I'm in the process of actually revamping it a little bit so that it's a little bit simpler because there's so many things there, but that's where all the things are at jillstoddard.com. I even have a quiz. So there are these like 5 kind of subtypes of imposter that we didn't talk about today, but it's like the perfectionist and the expert and the superhuman. So there's like a quiz on there that you can take to see like what type of imposter am I, that I think can be really helpful because then you spot it once you know, like I'm the expert, which is the person who needs one more class, one more this, one more that, then I can do it, kind of the gap trap thing. And then when I notice I'm doing that, it's like, nope, Jill, you know enough. You don't need another class. Just do the thing. So that could be a helpful resource for folks too.
Fascinating. So now that you mentioned it, I'm going to ask you about it. Can you be more than one at the same time?
You sure can. So most people see themselves in one more than the others, but typically, and actually the way the quiz is set up is you get percentages. So you might be 60% expert and, 32% this and 8% this and 0% this. So yes, you can absolutely have characteristics of more than one. And when I say subtype, really what it is ways we try to overcompensate to prevent being outed as frauds. So if I just do everything perfectly, then nobody will find me out. And then of course they all backfire because nobody's perfect. You make a mistake. And then when that happens, it quote unquote proves that you're a fraud after all. And so there's sort of these like sticky morasses we get.
Yeah, definitely. And I see that one quite a bit in my work. Part of what's important for the keynote process is rehearsal. Often, it's a sticky one because oftentimes leaders, it's not their full-time job. So they have a day job. And so there's a lot of commitments and competing commitments, I'll call them. And so they get into this trap where they often don't rehearse as much as they should. And part of me always is curious about how much of that is a self-fulfilling prophecy of you being able to use that as a scapegoat as to why you maybe didn't perform as well as you could.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, kind of a little of that self-sabotage.
Yeah, it's
if
like,
it doesn't go well, it's because I didn't practice enough. But if I really do everything I can in my power to do it well, and then it still doesn't go well, then wow, that hurts. Be a painful thing. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So I see that a lot. And I always try to reflect back on myself. And when I'm looking at that, to look at, okay, where that might be showing up and to use the good tips you gave us today around acting and committing. I look forward to using those to be able to look at, okay, how can I do that to make sure I'm not setting myself up and my ego is not getting really creative.
Egos do get creative.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I look forward to having you back and also just maybe when my book is out, we can talk more, get your input
Yeah,
on that.
absolutely. I would love it. Thank you
I love
so
it.
much. This was
Thank
great.
you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into the Unworthy Leader Podcast, where we believe in leading with more honesty, heart, and humanity. If today's episode made you think, feel, or see things differently, make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to become an official member of our community. Please consider sharing this with someone else who this may inspire or support. For more tools, resources, and conversations, head to the unworthyleaderpodcast.com. Until next week, stay true to yourself.